In the frozen wasteland of Stalingrad, where death wore 1,000 faces and hope seemed buried beneath the rubble, a legend was born from the most unlikely source. While armies clashed and cities burned, one woman's rifle would speak louder than artillery, and her bullets would carry more than lead. They would carry the soul of a nation fighting for survival. This is not just a story about war. This is about Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the deadliest female sniper in history, whose 309 confirmed kills made her both hero and target, savior and hunter. But more than that, this is about the moment when a grieving nation looked to the skies, searching for their fallen leader's body, never knowing that their salvation lay not in the heavens above, but in the crosshairs of a woman who had already cheated death more times than any soldier should. In World War II's most brutal theater, where the average life expectancy of a Soviet sniper was just 3 days, she would rewrite the rules of warfare itself. This is her story. Raw, unfiltered, and more incredible than any fiction Hollywood could imagine. The morning of June 22, 1941, started like any other for Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She was 25 years old, a history student at Kiev University, spending her summer working at a munitions factory. The sun had barely risen when she heard the distant rumble that would change everything. At first, she thought it was thunder. Then the sirens began to wail. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Hitler's war machine, the most powerful military force the world had ever seen, was rolling across the Soviet border, with 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and dreams of conquest that stretched from Moscow to the Urals. In a few hours, everything Lyudmila knew about her peaceful life would be torn apart like paper in a hurricane. The factory where she worked erupted into chaos. Workers ran in every direction, some heading home to their families, others grabbing whatever weapons they could find. The radio crackled with desperate broadcasts from Moscow. Stalin's voice, usually so confident and commanding, carried an edge of panic that sent chills down everyone's spine. The motherland was under attack. But Lyudmila Pavlichenko was not like other women. While her female classmates had spent their university years studying literature and languages, she had joined the shooting club. While they learned to cook and sew, she learned to hunt and shoot. Her grandfather, a veteran of the Great War, had taught her that a weapon was just a tool, but the person holding it was what made the difference between life and death. She'd always been different. Born in a small village near Kiev, she grew up poor but proud. Her family had nothing but their dignity and their determination to make something of themselves. When other girls played with dolls, Lyudmila was out in the forest with her grandfather, learning to track deer and rabbits. By the time she was 12, she could hit a moving target at 100 meters without breaking a sweat. Her parents had hoped she would become a teacher or maybe a nurse. Nice, respectable jobs for a young woman in Soviet society. But Lyudmila had bigger dreams. She wanted to study history, to understand how the world worked, how nations rose and fell, how ordinary people could change the course of events. She was fascinated by stories of Russian warriors, especially the women who had fought alongside men in times of great crisis. Now, as German bombers filled the sky like deadly birds, and the ground shook beneath her feet, those childhood dreams seemed like fantasies from another life. Reality was much simpler and much more terrifying. The enemy was at the gates and everyone had to choose fight or die. Lyudmila made her choice without hesitation. She walked to the nearest military recruitment office, a small building that was already overflowing with young men eager to defend their country. The recruiting sergeant, a grizzled veteran with scars on his face and tobacco stains on his fingers, looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. "Go home, girl," he said, not unkindly. "This is no place for someone like you. Find yourself a job in a factory making bullets or become a nurse. Leave the fighting to the men." But Lyudmila had not walked 3 miles through streets filled with panic and confusion to be turned away by some bureaucrat who thought he knew what women could and could not do. She looked the sergeant straight in the eye and said something that would become legendary among Soviet forces. "I can shoot better than half the men in this room," she declared. "Give me a rifle and let me prove it." The sergeant laughed. Several of the young men waiting in line laughed too. They saw a pretty young woman with soft hands and clean clothes. Someone who belonged in a classroom or a kitchen, not on a battlefield where death came without warning and survival depended on split-second decisions. "Prove it then," the sergeant said, figuring he could have some fun at her expense. "There's a shooting range out back. Show us what you can do." What happened next would be talked about in military circles for decades. Lyudmila picked up the standard Soviet rifle, a Mosin Nagant that most recruits struggled with for weeks. She examined it quickly, checking the sights and the action, then walked to the firing line. The target was set at 150 meters, a standard distance for basic marksmanship training. She raised the rifle, took a deep breath, and fired 5 shots in rapid succession. When they checked the target, all 5 bullets had hit within a circle the size of a teacup. The laughter stopped. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of air raid sirens and the rumble of artillery somewhere to the west. "Holy Mother of God," whispered one of the young recruits. "She shoots like a demon." The sergeant's attitude changed completely. He had been in the army for 20 years, had served in conflicts most people had never heard of, and he knew real talent when he saw it. This young woman was not just good with a rifle, she was exceptional. In times like these, exceptional people could mean the difference between victory and defeat. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked. "My grandfather taught me," Ludmila replied simply. "He said that when you aim a rifle, you are not just pointing a piece of metal. You are extending your will across distance. You are making a choice about who lives and who dies." Within hours, Ludmila Pavlichenko was officially enlisted in the Red Army. But her journey to becoming the most feared sniper on the Eastern Front was just beginning. The real test would come when she faced her first German soldier through the scope of her rifle, when the target shooting back, and the stakes were not just pride, but survival. The train that carried her toward the front lines was packed with soldiers, most of them boys barely out of their teens. They sang patriotic songs and told jokes to hide their fear, but Ludmila could see the terror in their eyes. They were heading into a meat grinder that had already consumed entire divisions. Most of them would not live to see their next birthday. She spent the long journey cleaning her rifle and studying maps of the areas where she would likely be deployed. Other soldiers tried to talk to her, some out of curiosity, others with less honorable intentions. But something about her quiet intensity and the way she handled her weapon made even the most aggressive men keep their distance. The train rolled through countryside that showed the scars of war, burned villages, abandoned farms, refugees streaming eastward with everything they owned packed into wooden carts. German planes flew overhead constantly, sometimes dropping bombs, sometimes just observing. The message was clear. Nowhere was safe. Nowhere was beyond the reach of Hitler's war machine. As they got closer to the front, the sound of artillery became constant. The earth shook, windows rattled, and the very air seemed to vibrate with violence. New recruits who had been joking and laughing just hours before now sat in silence, staring out the windows at a landscape that looked like the end of the world. Ludmila felt something she had never experienced before, a cold clarity that seemed to slow down time and sharpen every detail. She could count the rivets in the train car's walls, could hear individual conversations among the dozens of soldiers around her, could smell the fierce sweat and gun oil and the metallic taste of approaching battle. Her grandfather had told her about this feeling, how the best hunters developed an almost supernatural awareness when they were tracking dangerous prey. "The prey you will hunt now is more dangerous than any animal," she whispered to herself, repeating words her grandfather had spoken years before. "It thinks, it plans, it wants to kill you as much as you want to kill it. But if you remember your training, if you stay calm and shoot straight, you will survive. More than that, you will make a difference." The train finally stopped at a station that no longer had a name. The signs had been torn down or destroyed by bombing, and the platform was crowded with military trucks, wounded soldiers, and officers shouting orders in voices hoarse from days of continuous combat. This was the end of the line, literally and figuratively. Everything beyond this point was Indian country, where the enemy could be hiding behind any tree or in any building. Ludmila stepped off the train with her rifle slung across her shoulder and her few personal possessions in a canvas bag. She had no idea that she was about to begin a journey that would make her one of the most celebrated soldiers in Soviet history, or that her actions in the coming months would inspire generations of women to believe they could do anything men could do. All she knew was that somewhere out there, German soldiers were killing her people, destroying her country, and threatening everything she had ever cared about. And she was going to stop them, one bullet at a time. The assignment that would define Ludmila Pavlichenko's legend came on a grey morning in August 1941, when the siege of Sevastopol was entering its bloodiest phase. The ancient fortress city, guardian of the Black Sea for over 1,000 years, had become a symbol of Soviet resistance. Every street, every building, every pile of rubble had been fought over with a savagery that shocked even veteran soldiers. Ludmila had already made a name for herself in the weeks since arriving at the front. Her first kill had come during a German advance on the outskirts of the city. She had been positioned in the ruins of an old church, watching through her scope as enemy soldiers moved through what they thought was abandoned territory. When a German officer stepped into her crosshairs, she felt a moment of hesitation. This was not hunting deer in the forest with her grandfather. This was taking a human life. But then she remembered the bombed villages, the refugees fleeing with their children, the stories of German atrocities that every soldier had heard. Her fingers squeezed the trigger, and the officer dropped like a stone. Her first confirmed kill. It would not be her last. Word spread quickly through the Soviet forces about the young woman who could hit targets that seasoned marksmen missed. Other snipers, all of them men, initially resented her presence. They made crude jokes, questioned her courage, and waited for her to break under pressure. But as her kill count grew, the jokes stopped. Professional soldiers recognized professional ability regardless of who possessed it. Her commanding officer, Major Petrov, was a career military man who had survived Stalin's purges by being competent, loyal, and lucky. He had initial doubts about having a woman in his unit, but Ludmila's results spoke for themselves. In her first month of combat, she had eliminated more than 30 enemy soldiers, including several officers and 2 other snipers who had been terrorizing Soviet positions. "Pavlichenko," he said one morning as she cleaned her rifle in the dugout that served as sniper headquarters, "I have a special assignment for you." The major's tone was different than usual. More serious, more urgent. Ludmila looked up from her weapon, noting the tension in his face and the way his hand shook slightly as he lit a cigarette. Whatever this assignment was, it was not routine. "There is a situation developing that requires your particular skills," Petrov continued. "Intelligence reports indicate that a high-ranking German commander has been operating in this sector, someone important enough that Berlin is very interested in his activities and his safety." Ludmila nodded, waiting for more information. She had learned that military briefings often contained as much information in what was not said as in what was explicitly stated. "This commander has been coordinating attacks on civilian targets," Petrov said. "Hospitals, schools, refugee centers. The kind of targets that serve no military purpose except to terrorize the population and break morale." The major paused, taking a long drag on his cigarette. In the distance, artillery rumbled like an approaching thunderstorm. "Yesterday, this commander made a mistake. He targeted a children's hospital on the other side of the city. 43 kids died in the bombing. Nurses, doctors, even some mothers who were visiting their sick children." Ludmila felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had seen many horrible things since the war began, but the deliberate targeting of children was something that went beyond military strategy into pure evil. "Intelligence believes this commander will be visiting a forward observation post tomorrow morning," Petrov continued. "It is heavily defended, and a conventional attack would cost us hundreds of casualties with little chance of success. But a single sniper, positioned correctly, might have an opportunity." He pulled out a map and spread it on the crude wooden table. The observation post was marked in red, surrounded by German defensive positions that looked impregnable. But there was a small hill about 800 meters away that offered a clear line of sight. 800 meters was an extremely long shot, even for an expert marksman. At that distance, wind, humidity, even the rotation of the earth could affect bullet trajectory. "The shot would have to be perfect," Petrov said. "One bullet, one opportunity. Miss, and the position will be overrun within minutes." Ludmila studied the map carefully, calculating angles and distances, considering wind patterns and escape routes. It was a suicide mission disguised as a tactical assignment. The chances of making the shot were slim. The chances of escaping afterward were even slimmer. "When do I leave?" she asked. Petrov smiled grimly. He had expected her to accept, but her immediate commitment still impressed him. This young woman had the kind of courage that won wars. "Tonight, you will have support from a reconnaissance team who will get you into position, but once you take the shot, you are on your own." The next 18 hours passed like a strange dream. Ludmila spent the afternoon preparing her equipment with obsessive care. She cleaned her rifle until it gleamed, checked and rechecked her scope, calculated bullet drop at various distances. She wrote a letter to her parents, though she did not mention where she was or what she was about to do. If something went wrong, she wanted them to know she had died fighting for something she believed in. As darkness fell, she met with the reconnaissance team that would guide her to the shooting position. 3 men, all of them veterans of special operations behind enemy lines. They moved through the ruins of Sevastopol like ghosts, avoiding German patrols and navigating by moonlight and memory. The journey took 4 hours of crawling through rubble, sliding through bombed-out buildings, and hiding in shell craters while enemy soldiers passed within arm's reach. By the time they reached the designated hill, Ludmila was exhausted, filthy, and completely focused on the task ahead. She spent the remaining hours before dawn studying the German observation post through her scope. It was exactly as intelligence had described, a reinforced concrete bunker with an excellent view of Soviet positions and heavy defensive armaments. Guards patrolled the perimeter constantly, and machine gun nests covered every approach. A frontal assault would indeed be suicide. But from her position on the hill, she had a clear shot at the bunker's entrance. If the German commander appeared at the scheduled time, and if she could make an 800-meter shot under combat conditions, she might be able to eliminate a target that could save hundreds of Soviet lives. As the sun began to rise, painting the destroyed city in shades of gold and crimson, Ludmila settled into her shooting position. She controlled her breathing, focused her mind, and waited. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of morning activity in the German positions. Soldiers calling to each other, vehicles moving. The routine noises of an army preparing for another day of war. Then, exactly as intelligence had predicted, a black staff car approached the observation post. Through her scope, Ludmila could see German officers emerging from the vehicle. One of them, a tall man with the insignia of a colonel, matched the description of her target. The man who had ordered the bombing of a children's hospital was walking directly into her crosshairs. She made the final adjustments to her scope, accounting for wind and distance. At 800 meters, she would have to aim several feet above her target to compensate for bullet drop. The slightest error in calculation or the smallest tremor in her hands would send the bullet harmlessly into the concrete wall of the bunker. The German colonel stood talking with his subordinates, apparently unaware that death was watching him through a telescopic sight. He gestured towards Soviet positions, probably planning the next phase of the bombardment that would kill more civilians, more children, more innocent people, whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ludmila took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The bullet traveled the 800 meters in less than a second, carrying with it not just lead and powder, but the hopes of a besieged city and the vengeance of 43 dead children. Through her scope, she saw the German colonel's head snap back as if he had been struck by an invisible fist. He dropped to the ground, and chaos erupted around the observation post. Officers ran in every direction, shouting orders and trying to locate the source of the shot. But Ludmila was already moving, sliding backward down the hill as German artillery began to zero in on her position. She had perhaps 5 minutes before the entire area would be saturated with explosive shells. The reconnaissance team was waiting at a predetermined rally point, and together they began the dangerous journey back to Soviet lines. News of the successful assassination spread through the defenders of Sevastopol like wildfire. The German colonel had been a key figure in coordinating attacks on civilian targets, and his death would disrupt enemy operations for weeks. More importantly, it proved that even the most protected German commanders were not beyond the reach of Soviet justice. For Ludmila Pavlichenko, it was confirmation that she had found her true calling in this war. She was not just a soldier, she was an instrument of precision, a hunter of those who preyed on the innocent. Each shot she fired carried the weight of moral purpose, and each target she eliminated brought her country one step closer to victory. The winter of 1942 brought a different kind of warfare to the Eastern Front. Snow fell in sheets that turned the battlefield into a white hell where visibility dropped to mere meters and frostbite killed almost as many soldiers as bullets. For Ludmila Pavlichenko, now recognized as one of the Red Army's most effective snipers, winter warfare meant adapting to conditions that would have broken lesser soldiers. Her reputation had grown far beyond the siege of Sevastopol. Military newspapers wrote articles about the young woman who had killed more than 200 German soldiers. Radio broadcasts mentioned her achievements, carefully avoiding specific details that might help enemy intelligence locate her. German forces had begun offering substantial bounties for information leading to her capture or death. But fame came with a price that Ludmila had not anticipated. She found herself increasingly isolated from other soldiers, who treated her with a mixture of respect and unease. Some saw her as a symbol of Soviet determination, others as something unnatural, a woman who had crossed into a realm that traditionally belonged only to men. The casual friendships that sustained other soldiers through the horror of war were largely unavailable to her. The assignment that would define her legacy came during the brutal fighting around Stalingrad. The city that bore Stalin's name had become a symbol that neither side could afford to lose. German forces controlled most of the urban area, but Soviet defenders clung to pockets of resistance with desperate tenacity. Every building, every floor, sometimes every room, was contested in fighting so savage that veterans compared it to medieval sieges. Major Petrov, now promoted to colonel after his own displays of tactical brilliance, called Ludmila to his command bunker on a February morning when the temperature had dropped below -30 degrees. The bunker was deep underground, carved out of the frozen earth and reinforced with concrete and steel. Even here, the sound of artillery was constant, a rumbling that made conversation difficult and sleep nearly impossible. "Pavlichenko," he said without preamble, "we have received intelligence about a target that could change the entire strategic situation in this sector." Lyudmila sat down across from her commanding officer, noting the unusual tension in his voice. Colonel Petrov had always been direct, but this conversation felt different. More urgent, more secretive. "German forces have been using a particular building as a command center," he continued, pointing to a map that showed the contested areas of Stalingrad. "Intelligence believes that a high-ranking officer, possibly a general, has been coordinating operations from this location." The building was marked in red on the map, deep in German-controlled territory. It was surrounded by defensive positions, machine gun nests, and cleared fields of fire that would make any approach extremely dangerous. "What makes this target special?" Lyudmila asked. Colonel Petrov hesitated, then pulled out a photograph. It showed a German general in full-dress uniform standing next to other high-ranking officers. The man was tall, distinguished, with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of successful military campaigns. "This is General Friedrich Paulus," Petrov said, "commander of the German 6th Army, and the man responsible for the siege of this city. If intelligence is correct, and if he is indeed operating from this building, eliminating him could cripple German operations throughout the region." Lyudmila studied the photograph carefully. She had learned to memorize the faces of her targets, to study their features until she could recognize them instantly through a rifle scope. Paulus looked like a career soldier, someone who had probably fought in the Great War and risen through the ranks based on competence and political reliability. "The shot would be extremely difficult," Petrov continued. "The building is over 900 meters from the nearest position we can establish. At that distance, environmental factors become critical. Wind, temperature, even atmospheric pressure can affect bullet trajectory." 900 meters. Lyudmila had made shots at 800 meters, but 900 was beyond the normal effective range of her rifle. It would require perfect conditions, flawless execution, and a substantial amount of luck. "What kind of support would I have?" she asked. "Minimal," Petrov admitted. "This has to be a covert operation. Too much activity would alert German forces and they would simply move their command center. You would go in alone, establish a position, and wait for the opportunity." Lyudmila considered the tactical situation. A 900-meter shot in urban combat conditions, with no backup and minimal support. If she missed, German forces would immediately begin searching for her. If she was captured, the propaganda value alone would be enormous for the enemy. But if she succeeded, the death of a German general could disrupt enemy operations throughout the region. "How long would I have to wait?" she asked. "Intelligence suggests that the target maintains a regular schedule," Petrov said. "Morning briefings, afternoon inspections of forward positions. If he follows his usual pattern, you might have multiple opportunities. Multiple opportunities, but also multiple chances for something to go wrong. The longer she remained in position, the greater the likelihood of discovery. German counter-sniper operations had become increasingly sophisticated, and they were specifically hunting for her. "When do I deploy?" she asked. Colonel Petrov smiled grimly. He had expected her to accept the mission, but her immediate commitment still impressed him. In 2 years of war, he had never seen Lyudmila Pavlichenko refuse an assignment, regardless of how dangerous it might be. "Tonight, you will infiltrate the area under cover of darkness and establish a shooting position. Then you wait." The preparation took most of the day. Lyudmila cleaned her rifle with obsessive care, checking every component and making minute adjustments to her scope. She studied aerial photographs of the target area, memorizing every building, every street, every potential hiding place or escape route. She practiced the shot on a training range, firing at targets placed at 900 meters to get a feel for the trajectory and timing. As evening approached, she blackened her face with burnt cork and dressed in winter camouflage that would make her nearly invisible against the snow. Her rifle was wrapped in white cloth, and she carried extra ammunition, emergency rations, and a knife that she hoped she would never need to use in close combat. The infiltration route took her through the ruins of a factory complex that had been destroyed in earlier fighting. She moved like a ghost, sliding through shadows and avoiding the regular patrols that German forces maintained throughout their territory. The cold was brutal, seeping through her clothing and making her muscles stiff, but she had learned to function in conditions that would incapacitate ordinary soldiers. It took 6 hours to reach her designated position, the top floor of a partially destroyed apartment building that offered a clear line of sight to the German command center. She established herself in a room that had once been someone's bedroom, now open to the sky with walls pockmarked by shrapnel and bullet holes. Through her rifle scope, she could see the German command building clearly. It was a substantial structure, probably built before the war as an office building or government facility. Now it bristled with radio antennas and defensive positions. German soldiers moved in and out constantly, and she could see staff cars coming and going at regular intervals. She settled into wait, knowing that patience was as important as marksmanship in her profession. Hours passed with no sign of her target. Dawn came slowly, painting the destroyed city in shades of grey and pink that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Then, at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, a convoy of staff cars arrived at the command building. Through her scope, Ludmilla watched as German officers emerged from the vehicles. She studied each face carefully, comparing them to the photograph of General Paulus that she had memorized. There, the third man out of the second car, tall, distinguished, wearing the uniform of a German general. Even at 900 meters, she could see that this was her target. The man whose death could change the course of the battle for Stalingrad was walking directly into her crosshairs. She made the final adjustments to her scope, compensating for wind speed and direction, temperature, and the slight downward angle of the shot. At 900 meters, she would have to aim almost 10 feet above her target to account for bullet drop. The margin for error was essentially zero. General Paulus stood talking with his staff officers, apparently reviewing plans for the day's operations. He gestured towards Soviet positions, probably discussing tactics for reducing the remaining pockets of resistance. He looked confident, professional, completely unaware that his life hung by the thread of one woman's skill with a rifle. Ludmilla controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate and focusing her entire being on the shot. She had fired thousands of rounds in training, had killed more than 200 enemy soldiers, but this shot felt different, more important, more significant than anything she had done before. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the bullet began its 1-second journey across 900 meters of war-torn cityscape. For that 1 second, everything hung in the balance. The success or failure of a critical mission, the life or death of a German general, the course of one of the most important battles in human history. Through her scope, Ludmilla saw General Paulus stumble, then collapse. Chaos erupted around the command building as officers ran in every direction. Some trying to help their fallen commander, others scanning the surrounding buildings for signs of the sniper who had struck from impossible range. But Ludmilla was already moving, packing her rifle and preparing to evacuate. She had perhaps 10 minutes before German forces would begin a systematic search of every building within sniper range. Her escape route led through the same factory ruins she had used for infiltration, but now she would have to move much faster, before the area was flooded with enemy soldiers. As she slipped away from her shooting position, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The shot had been perfect, a demonstration of skill that would be talked about in military circles for decades. More importantly, she had eliminated a target whose death would save countless Soviet lives and bring her country one step closer to victory in the most important war in human history. The aftermath of the Stalingrad shot brought Ludmilla Pavlichenko to the attention of people far beyond the military command structure. Word of the impossible 900-meter kill had reached Moscow, where Stalin himself had taken notice of the young woman who was terrorizing German forces. But with recognition came new pressures and responsibilities that would test her in ways different from anything she had experienced on the battlefield. The promotion to senior lieutenant came with a medal ceremony attended by journalists from Pravda and Red Star, the official military newspaper. Ludmilla found herself uncomfortable with the attention, preferring the solitary focus of her sniper work to the political theater of propaganda events. But she understood that her image had become important to Soviet morale, and she accepted the role even though it felt foreign to her nature. More concerning was the intelligence that German forces had tripled the bounty on her head and were bringing in their best counter-snipers specifically to hunt her. The enemy had studied her methods, analyzed her shooting positions, and developed tactics designed to trap the sniper who had humiliated them so thoroughly. Every mission now carried the additional risk that she was walking into an elaborate ambush. Colonel Petrov, now operating from a command bunker that had been reinforced against increasingly sophisticated German artillery, called her in for a briefing that would prove to be unlike any previous assignment. The winter of 1942 was giving way to spring, and both sides were preparing for what everyone knew would be decisive battles that could determine the outcome of the entire war. "Ludmilla," he said, his voice carrying a weight that immediately told her this was not a routine mission briefing. "We have received intelligence about a situation that requires your particular expertise, but I must warn you that this assignment is more dangerous than anything you have undertaken before." She sat across from her commanding officer, noting the unusual tension in his demeanor. Petrov had always been direct with her, never sugarcoating the risks or exaggerating the importance of her missions. If he was warning her about danger, The situation must be genuinely extraordinary. German forces have established a new command center in a location that our conventional forces cannot reach, he continued, spreading a map across his desk. It is heavily fortified, surrounded by defensive positions that would require a full divisional assault to penetrate. But intelligence suggests that it houses something much more valuable than a typical field headquarters. The location marked on the map was deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by open terrain that offered no concealment for advancing troops. It looked like a fortress, the kind of position that could withstand a prolonged siege. What makes this target so important? Ludmila asked. Petrov hesitated, then pulled out a folder marked with classification stamps that indicated information of the highest sensitivity. Inside were photographs, technical drawings, and documents that made Ludmila's eyes widen with understanding. The Germans are developing new weapons, Petrov said quietly. Rockets, guided missiles, aircraft that could change the entire strategic balance.
This facility appears to be coordinating the testing and deployment of these weapon systems.
Ludmila studied the technical drawings, trying to understand the implications of what she was seeing.
The weapons described in these documents were unlike anything currently deployed by either side. If the Germans succeeded in perfecting these technologies, they could potentially turn defeat into victory. Intelligence believes that a crucial meeting is scheduled at this facility, Petrov continued. Scientists, military engineers, high-ranking officers, who are responsible for the entire program. If this meeting could be disrupted, it might set back German weapons development by months or even years. The tactical situation was unlike anything Ludmila had faced before. The target facility was over 1,500 meters from the nearest position that could provide concealment. At that distance, her rifle was operating well beyond its design specifications. Environmental factors would have enormous impact on bullet trajectory, and the margin for error would be virtually non-existent.
This is beyond the effective range of standard sniper weapons,
she pointed out. We know, Petrov replied. That is why our technical specialists have been working on modifications to your rifle. Extended barrel, specialized ammunition, enhanced scope optics. The weapon will be unique, designed specifically for this mission. He led her to an adjoining room where a group of engineers and armorers had been working on what looked like a rifle, but unlike any weapon Ludmila had ever seen. The barrel was longer and heavier, the scope was enormous, and the overall construction suggested a weapon built for precision at extreme range. We have calculated that with the right conditions and perfect execution, a shot at 1,500 meters might be possible, one of the engineers explained. But it would require absolute precision in every variable. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, even the rotation of the Earth becomes a factor at this distance. Ludmila examined the modified rifle carefully, noting the weight and balance. It was much heavier than her standard weapon, which would make it difficult to maneuver in combat situations. But the engineering was impressive, clearly the work of specialists who understood the physics of long-range marksmanship. When is this meeting scheduled? She asked. Tomorrow, Petrov replied. Intelligence suggests that the participants will be gathering for a critical review of their weapons programs. This may be our only opportunity to disrupt their development timeline. 24 hours to prepare for the most difficult shot of her career. Ludmila spent the rest of the day familiarizing herself with the modified rifle, practicing with the new scope, and calculating the ballistics for a 1,500-meter shot. The mathematics involved were complex, requiring her to account for factors that rarely mattered at shorter ranges. The infiltration would be even more challenging than the shooting itself. The route to the target area required her to cross 30 kilometers of enemy-controlled territory, moving only at night and avoiding the patrols that German forces maintained throughout their rear areas. She would have to carry the heavy rifle, additional ammunition, and survival equipment for what could be a multi-day mission. As darkness fell, Ludmila began the most dangerous journey of her military career. She moved through the countryside like a phantom, avoiding roads and settlements, navigating by stars and compass. The modified rifle was strapped to her back, its weight making every step more difficult. But she had trained for situations like this. By dawn, she had reached a forest that provided concealment within range of the German facility. Through binoculars, she could see the target building clearly. It was exactly as intelligence had described, a substantial structure surrounded by defensive positions and guard towers. German soldiers patrolled the perimeter constantly, and she could see vehicles arriving throughout the morning. She established her shooting position in a tree line that offered both concealment and a clear line of sight to the target. The distance was exactly 1,520 meters, measured with a rangefinder that was itself a piece of precision engineering. At this range, she could see individual figures moving around the building. but identifying specific targets would require the enhanced scope of her modified rifle. The waiting began again, but this time with an intensity unlike anything she had experienced before. This was not just another military target. This was an opportunity to strike at the heart of German weapons development, to potentially save thousands of lives by preventing the deployment of advanced weapons systems. As the morning progressed, she watched through her scope as various German officers and civilians entered the target building. Some were clearly military personnel, others appeared to be scientists or engineers. The meeting that intelligence had predicted was definitely taking place. Then, shortly before noon, a convoy of staff cars arrived that seemed different from the routine traffic she had been observing. These vehicles were more heavily escorted. Their occupants moved with the kind of urgency that suggested high-level importance. Through her scope, she watched as a group of men emerged from the cars and entered the building. One of them matched the description of Dr. Bulv, Werner von Braun, the German rocket scientist who was reportedly leading their advanced weapons program. If intelligence was correct, this man's death could set back German missile development by years, potentially changing the entire trajectory of the war. Ludmilla made her final preparations, adjusting her scope for the 1,500-meter shot and calculating the environmental factors that would affect bullet trajectory. The wind was light and steady, temperature was moderate, and atmospheric conditions were as favorable as she could hope for. She controlled her breathing, slowed her heart rate, and focused every aspect of her being on the most important shot of her career. At 1,500 meters, the bullet would take almost 2 seconds to reach its target. In that time, the target could move, wind conditions could change, and a dozen other factors could cause the shot to miss. Through her scope, she watched as her target emerged from the building, apparently conducting an inspection of security arrangements around the facility. He stood in the open for several seconds, completely unaware that death was watching him from over a kilometer away. Ludmilla squeezed the trigger. The modified rifle kicked harder than any weapon she had ever fired, and the sound of the shot echoed across the countryside like thunder. For 2 long seconds, she tracked the bullet's path through her scope, watching as it covered the impossible distance to its target. The impact was visible even at 1,500 meters. Her target dropped immediately, and chaos erupted around the German facility. Officers ran in every direction. Vehicles raced toward the perimeter, and alarms began sounding throughout the complex. But Ludmilla was already moving, packing her equipment, and beginning the dangerous journey back to Soviet lines. She had accomplished something that military experts would later call impossible, a successful sniper engagement at 1,500 meters under combat conditions. More importantly, she had struck a blow at the heart of German weapons development that would have consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The death of a key scientist would delay projects that could have turned the tide of war, saving countless lives and bringing victory one step closer for her beleaguered nation. The final mission of Ludmilla Pavlichenko's combat career came in the spring of 1943, when the tide of war was beginning to turn, but victory remained uncertain. By this time, her name had become legend throughout the Red Army, and German forces had made hunting her a top priority. Counterintelligence reports suggested that elite German snipers were being deployed specifically to eliminate the woman who had humiliated their forces for nearly 2 years. Her official kill count had reached 309 confirmed eliminations, making her the deadliest female sniper in recorded history. Each of those numbers represented not just a military target, but a story of survival, skill, and determination that had inspired Soviet forces throughout the Eastern Front. But fame had also made her a marked woman, and Moscow was beginning to consider whether her propaganda value might be more important than her continued combat effectiveness. The assignment that would end her fighting career came from the highest levels of command. Stalin himself had reportedly taken interest in an intelligence report about a German operation so audacious that it seemed almost impossible to believe. If the information was accurate, German forces were planning to use a captured Soviet aircraft to infiltrate deep into Soviet territory and assassinate key political and military leaders. Colonel Petrov, now bearing the scars of 2 years of brutal warfare, called Ludmilla to his command bunker for what he somehow knew would be their final mission briefing together. The facility had been upgraded multiple times, as the importance of sniper operations became clear to high command, and it now resembled a small underground city dedicated to precision warfare. "Ludmilla," he said, his voice carrying the weight of countless battles and impossible decisions. "What I am about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. The information comes directly from Moscow, and the mission parameters are unlike anything we have attempted before." She sat across from her commanding officer, noting the exhaustion in his eyes and the way his hand shook slightly when he thought no one was watching. 2 years of war had aged him decades, but his mind remained sharp, and his commitment to victory absolute. Intelligence has intercepted communications suggesting that German forces have captured one of our aircraft and are planning to use it for a deep penetration mission, Petrov continued. The target appears to be a high-level meeting of Soviet leadership that is scheduled to take place behind our lines. The implications were staggering. If German forces could successfully infiltrate Soviet airspace and eliminate key leadership figures, the psychological impact alone could be devastating. More practically, the loss of experienced commanders could disrupt military operations throughout the region. The captured aircraft is reportedly being modified to carry a team of German special forces, Petrov said, pulling out aerial photographs that showed an airfield deep in enemy territory. Intelligence believes that the mission will launch from this location within the next 48 hours. Lyudmila studied the photographs carefully. The airfield was heavily defended, surrounded by anti-aircraft positions and fighter squadrons that would make any conventional attack extremely costly. But there was a ridgeline approximately 1,800 meters from the main runway that might provide a shooting position for a sufficiently skilled sniper. 1,800 meters, she said quietly. That's beyond the effective range of any sniper weapon. Our technical specialists have been working on another modification to your rifle, Petrov replied. Experimental ammunition, enhanced optics, structural improvements that push the weapon well beyond its original specifications. But even with these improvements, the shot would be at the absolute limit of what physics allows. He led her to the armorer's workshop, where engineers had created what looked more like a small artillery piece than a rifle. The barrel was enormous, the scope was the size of a telescope, and the overall construction suggested a weapon designed for a single, perfect shot at impossible range. The target would not be a person, Petrov explained. Intelligence suggests that disrupting the aircraft while it is on the runway would be more effective than trying to intercept it in flight. A single shot into the fuel system or engine could prevent the mission from launching. Lyudmila examined the modified weapon carefully. It was so heavy that it would require a fixed mounting system, making it essentially a single-use weapon designed for one specific mission. The engineering was impressive, but the practical challenges were enormous. What kind of support would I have? She asked. Minimal, Petrov admitted. This has to be a covert infiltration. Too much activity would alert German forces, and they would simply move their operation to another location. You would go in alone, establish position, and wait for the target aircraft to appear. The infiltration route would take her through 50 kilometers of enemy-controlled territory, carrying a weapon that weighed more than some artillery pieces. The physical demands alone would be extreme, even for someone with her experience in behind-the-lines operations. The timeline is critical, Petrov continued. Intelligence suggests that the German mission is scheduled to launch tomorrow night. You would have one opportunity, and failure would mean that enemy forces could strike at the heart of Soviet leadership.
Way topical, efforts, domain.
Lyudmila considered the tactical situation. An 1,800-meter shot at a stationary aircraft using experimental equipment that had never been tested under combat conditions. The margin for error was essentially zero, and the consequences of failure were too significant to contemplate. When do I deploy? She asked. The preparation took 18 hours of intensive work. Lyudmila familiarized herself with the experimental rifle, practiced with ammunition that had been hand-loaded by ballistic specialists, and studied every detail of the target airfield from reconnaissance photographs. The mathematics of an 1,800-meter shot were complex beyond anything she had attempted before. The infiltration began at midnight, with Lyudmila moving through countryside that bore the scars of 2 years of warfare. Burned villages, abandoned farms, and the hulks of destroyed vehicles marked the passage of armies that had fought back and forth across this landscape. She carried the experimental rifle in a specially designed pack that distributed its weight across her entire body. By dawn, she had reached the ridgeline that would serve as her shooting position. The German airfield was clearly visible in the distance, exactly as intelligence had described. She could see aircraft parked on the runway, fuel trucks moving between them, and the constant activity of a military installation preparing for operations. She established her position with obsessive care, using surveying equipment to measure the exact distance to various points on the airfield. 1,837 meters to the main runway, where intelligence suggested the captured Soviet aircraft would be positioned for its mission. The waiting began again, but this time with knowledge that this would probably be her final combat mission. Moscow had made it clear that her propaganda value was becoming more important than her combat effectiveness. After this assignment, she would likely be transferred to training duties or public relations work. As the day progressed, she watched through her scope as activity on the airfield increased. Additional security patrols, fuel trucks positioning themselves near the runway, and the arrival of personnel who appeared to be special forces rather than regular airfield staff, everything suggested that a high-priority mission was indeed being prepared. Then, as evening approached, she saw it. A Soviet aircraft being towed onto the main runway by German ground crews. Even at 1,800 meters, she could see that the aircraft had been modified, probably to carry additional fuel and personnel for a long-range infiltration mission. German technicians swarmed around the aircraft, conducting final checks and loading equipment. Through her scope, she could see Special Forces personnel in Soviet uniforms practicing their boarding procedures. The deception was complete, designed to allow the aircraft to penetrate deep into Soviet airspace before anyone realized it was hostile. As darkness fell, the activity around the aircraft intensified. Final preparations were being made for a mission that could decapitate Soviet leadership and potentially change the course of the war. Lyudmila made her own final preparations, adjusting her scope for the 1,800-meter shot and calculating environmental factors that would affect the experimental ammunition. The target she had selected was the aircraft's fuel system, visible as external tanks that had been added to extend its range. A single well-placed shot could rupture the fuel system, creating a fire that would destroy the aircraft and prevent the mission from launching. At exactly 11 o'clock, she watched as the Special Forces team began boarding the aircraft. Ground crews were making final preparations, and she could see the pilot conducting pre-flight checks. In a few minutes, the aircraft would begin its takeoff roll, and the opportunity would be lost forever. Lyudmila controlled her breathing, focused her mind, and prepared for the most difficult shot of her career. 1,800 meters in darkness, using experimental equipment to hit a target that represented the difference between success and disaster for her nation's war effort. She squeezed the trigger. The experimental rifle produced a sound unlike anything she had ever heard. A thunderous crack that echoed across the countryside and would probably alert German forces to a position within minutes. The bullet began its 3-second journey across 1,800 meters of night air, carrying with it the hopes of a nation and the skill of the deadliest sniper in Soviet history. Through her scope, she watched as the bullet found its target. The fuel tank erupted in a brilliant fireball that illuminated the entire airfield. Secondary explosions followed as other fuel systems ignited, and within seconds the captured aircraft was completely engulfed in flames. The German Special Forces mission was over before it had begun. Personnel ran in every direction, fire trucks raced toward the burning aircraft, and alarms sounded throughout the facility. But the damage was complete. The infiltration mission that could have changed the course of the war had been stopped by a single, impossible shot in the darkness. Lyudmila packed her equipment and began the dangerous journey back to Soviet lines, knowing that German forces would soon begin a massive search operation. But she also knew that she had accomplished something truly extraordinary. A shot that would be remembered as long as people studied the art of precision marksmanship. More importantly, she had prevented a mission that could have devastated Soviet leadership and prolonged the war by years. The young woman who had walked into a recruitment office 2 years earlier, determined to defend her country, had fulfilled that promise in ways she could never have imagined. Her combat career was ending, but her legend was just beginning. The story of Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the deadliest female sniper in history, would inspire generations of people to believe that one person, with skill and determination, could change the course of human events.